if you've been on the internet lately, specifically if you've been on like twitter.com, you've probably seen the two guests we have today kind of going at it with apparently the entire rest of the internet. We have Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald. And the thing I think has really struck me about the conversation y'all have been having on social media is that it seems like something that's very generational. Like, I feel like when I was growing up, I generally thought of people who were less permissive, who were more like controlling or scolding as being on like the political right. Like when psychologists do the test for like how much people support authoritarianism, usually they just ask them like how permissive are you with your children. And I think if you asked me 15 years ago, like virtually everybody who's more like authoritarian in their personality or more conservative in their personality, I would think, oh yeah, they vote for Republicans. They're on that side of the aisle. I feel like increasingly, if somebody were to ask me that today, I'd be like, well, it could be either side. Like I could see like a Democrat like or a liberal leaning person actually like banning their kids from watching certain movies, saying that certain books are a corrupting influence, like monitoring their YouTube. And more, I kind of feel like I see that on the left. And I think that's what both of you have also kind of talked about in kind of the recent weeks. And I'm wondering if, if you think this is like a new development, how it compares to where it was maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just, I think it's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of truth to it, this generational perspective. Obviously, a lot of people know that Angela Nagel wrote a book essentially arguing that one of the reasons why the kind of new right has had so much success in attracting younger people is because that's where you now go to be culturally transgressive. 25 years ago in the 80s or the 90s, it was the age of the moral majority in the Catholic Church. And it was like Sinead O'Connor being culturally transgressive by ripping up a picture of the Pope. And that was how you were cool and edgy, was rebelling against right-wing cultural institutions. And so if you were 20 or 22 and looking to kind of sow your oats in that transgressive energy, you naturally went to the left. And obviously that went back to the 60s as well with that whole revolution there. One of the ways here in Brazil that I knew early on that Bolsonaro had a really good chance to win was in 2017, before people really were even thinking about the possibility that he was going to win. He went on to Twitter after I had called him a fascist, and he used this, this very vulgar phrase in Portuguese. It doesn't really translate into English, but he put it into Google Translate to say it into English to me, and it's called "burning the donut," which is like as you can imagine, is designed to evoke anal sex. It's very crude. It's like a complete homophobic epithet. But he said it to me in this like playful way, like, "Do you burn the donut? That's fine. Hugs." And for like 2 months after that, while like all the serious press in Brazil that hated me were, rising to my defense in this very earnest way, denouncing homophobia, which is never acceptable. I had like 20-year-olds and 18-year-old Brazilians sending me gifts of like donuts on fire. Just not like necessarily out of malice, but just because it was fun. It was like the thing they weren't allowed to do that he was giving them license to do. And yeah, I think like there is a lot to that like now the people who promulgate rules for how adults can have sexual relationships, almost like they're the Vatican, are the people who are found on the left. And there's this kind of sexual libertarianism, this libertarianism around our private lives, increasingly found on the right, that also has this transgressive energy that I think has done this generational reversal that you're talking about, that I think we're seeing play out as well with this whole debate that Matt and I have been involved in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Glenn and I have talked about this, that and I've written a couple of articles now basically trying to point out that one of the features of this, the new politics, is that it doesn't have the art, the music, the comedy that came out of, like, say, the 60s liberation movements. There's none of that. And I think this movement, as Glenn says, it's losing some young people because the codes of behavior are so strict, and that tendency to be the person who is constantly policing the speech of everybody else in the group. Again, that used to be the conservative in the room a long time ago, and that was why a lot of us became political liberals, right? If we remember Tipper Gore and the PMRC, right, or the bands of NWA, or the the banning of The Last Temptation of Christ, the movie. That was a movie I didn't even want to go see, but because the right made such a big deal out of it, a lot of us went to it, and that the roles have kind of been reversed now. And a lot of it, frankly, has to do with the fact that there's an argument that's being made that deplatforming is effective, which is something that I think our generation didn't believe. And we were always told that it was the opposite, that if you tried to censor something, it gave it more power. So it's an interesting debate, but certainly people feel very strongly about it on both sides.
It seems like you both have, a lot of the fights you're having with people aren't necessarily, and by that I mean like on Twitter and online. It seems to be taking place with people who aren't necessarily like, the leading purveyors of the culture or trying to promote the culture, but people that are mostly like just denying that it's happening. Like, why do you think there is such an investment on the part of like left intelligentsia on just denying that it's even happening?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, people say, well, who's really being hurt by this? It's not happening. And it's one of those things, like if you work in a media company or if you work in a university, nobody needs to be told that this is happening. It's a fact of life that's a significant factor in your day-to-day calculations about how you go about your business. And it only takes a couple of people to be fired for it to become really one of the dominant calculations in how you go about your work. You think about the New York Times right now. What editor isn't going to be thinking about every single editorial decision, through the lens of what happened with James Bennett? So I don't understand really where people are coming from when they say it doesn't happen, but there's certainly been a huge pushback on that question.
Well, I mean, look, if you do not have any independent thoughts or beliefs that diverge from that narrative, of course you're not going to see it happening, right? You're never in that uncomfortable space to experience that pushback. So it's very easy from that point of view to see those who are complaining about cancel culture. I wish we had a better phrase for it, but what we're these days discussing is cancel culture, to see it as just a bitter reaction from the old guard, who are pissed off that there are these upstarts who are making their voices heard. It's a very convenient narrative, but I can see how if you're entirely 100% consistent with that ideology, that's the way that the world would look to you. But the thing is that as these rules get stricter and stricter, there's going to be more and more people even within that ideology who are going to either advertently or inadvertently step outside of those margins, and they're going to experience the pushback. And so, yeah, I think the understanding that this culture exists is going to start to change.
I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before. Like, go back to the 1980s. In the 1990s, you had a movement of gay people who were saying the society is really repressive. And you had a larger group of social conservatives who didn't see the repression because what they wanted to do wasn't what was being constrained, because they weren't gay. They weren't interested in having lifelong relationships sanctioned by the state with people of the same sex. So you would try and show them, look, there's repression here. And of course they didn't see it because what they wanted to do was the orthodoxy. It was permitted. I think that's exactly the same here. There's no question that the left, broadly speaking, has won the culture wars, not the political wars or the economic wars, but the cultural wars, which is why you see, Chevron celebrating diversity and the CIA draping itself in the rainbow flag and celebrating its female agents. There's a hegemony on the left now where the left-wing cultural discourse is the obligatory discourse. And so the more newsrooms and corporations and campuses require adherence to that discourse, the more people who, as Leighton suggested, already believe in it are going to look at you like you're crazy when you say that there's increasing repression, because they're not going to see it, because they're not victimized by it, because they're adherents to it. It's always the case with censorship.
The other thing is, I think there's probably a little bit of lag in kind of perception of where you actually are in kind of the power hierarchy. Like, For instance, I think there were some comments by people who work for the New York Times when James Bennett was being ousted. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones, as well as Wajahat Ali, who I used to work with, they both made comments to the extent of saying something like, I might be risking my job saying this, or this is maybe a perilous thing for me to say. Like, as they were pressuring the New York Times to basically sanction James Bennett or push him out, they were suggesting that it was a risk for them to be doing that. From the outside, from someone who doesn't work there, it looked to me like all the risk was on James Bennett. Hundreds of people there signed a letter, backed by a union, even claiming that he maybe had imperiled their safety by helping publish this Tom Cotton op-ed. But I think a lot of the people involved probably sincerely affix themselves into the role of being victimized or marginalized or low on the hierarchy, to where even when they're expressing that power, they don't realize that they're in power. Because if you are in power, sometimes you're very confident about your ideas. You're not super threatened by like one conservative op-ed like getting into the paper every now and then. You're like, I still have 95% of the space on that op-ed page. I don't really have to feel all that threatened by it. But I think that if you adopt a mentality where it still is kind of the 1990s, then maybe you're thinking, it's always one step away from Tom Cotton taking over the op-ed page. Like every op-ed's going to be Tom Cottonism, which objectively looking at it isn't the case. And I think, Glenn, that gets to what you were saying about the moral majority, is that I think a lot of that was a reaction to the 60s and the 70s. And I think in their mind, they always thought Christians were under threat and under assault, even when Christians were like hegemonic in the culture, like right-wing Christians were hegemonic in American culture in the 80s or even the early 90s. And I think, but if you can have that power but not realize you have it, it's much more likely that you're going to be very, very authoritarian in using it, or illiberal in using it, because you just don't recognize. You always feel like you're under threat rather than actually being a threat to someone else's freedom of expression.
I also want to just point out that we're using the terms right and left as shorthand because there's no escaping it. But like the idea that this is a left-wing narrative that people are subordinating themselves to, I'm not persuaded that that's the case. I mean, we just did an episode of this show about how the National Labor Relations Board issued a ruling to make it easier for employers to fire employees in a labor dispute when they use bigoted language around sex and race. So that's the kind of decision that you could see some people on the quote unquote left cheering on because it's a strike against bigotry, whereas most of the left that I've always been familiar with would see this as a coup on the part of capital over labor. So like, is this a left-wing ideology? It feels like this puritanical, it feels like it goes beyond left and right. Like the closest analog I can think of to it isn't political at all. It's religious. It's the kind of the puritanical culture that's so strong in American history. But it just doesn't, I realize that we don't have the language to describe it as anything other than left-wing. But I don't think it's a left-wing ideology. It's something different.
Well, I mean, I think it's, I think that's an important point in the sense that, these institutions that we have long thought about as being anathema to left-wing politics, like corporations or even newsrooms, have increasingly become left-wing. Again, only in the cultural sense, right? Like they still love capitalism, but they use these left-wing cultural issues almost as a weapon to preserve the standard kind of capitalistic and imperialistic prerogatives. The thing, one of the things that has driven me crazy is like when people are like, there's no such thing as this cancel culture. It's really not even going on. And the way I know they're fucking just lying is because like one of the things that really molded my perceptions on all of this and that elevated my concern was I started lurking in outside consultant diversity sessions given to not necessarily my own company, but other companies. I started listening to, covertly taped managerial instructions about how people, it's a very corporatized code of communication that's being imparted and indoctrinated from the top down, as Leighton was suggesting. It's like a managerial form of control, increasingly proliferating these rules that employees of every kind, not like J.K. Rowling and David Frum and, Matt or myself, who are going to be fine. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, young journalists with no job security and no platform, or mid-managers at corporations who are being increasingly told that if they don't obey this mode of thought and this mode of communication, they're going to be punished and destroyed, and they're going to lose their job. And anyone who's listened to any of this or paid attention to these trends over the last couple of years, but particularly in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and is being honest, will acknowledge, whether they are for it or against it, that the changes are very radical and very repressive, not for high-level protected, wealthy, famous elites, but exactly for those people who lack the power and platform to safeguard themselves against it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I've gotten criticized a little bit for conflating terms like left and liberal when talking about this, because it is difficult to talk about. We don't have a language yet for it. It's clearly confusing because some of the people who've been best on this topic or most consistent, for instance, are like in the World Socialist website, who are very against all of this. And they've been really some of the only people, outside of Glenn and a few others in the entire media landscape, who've really been on top of things like questions like internet censorship. What does that mean long term? So they're clearly on the left, but they're very opposed to this. Meanwhile, you also saw, for beginning in 2016, the sort of corporate wing of the Democratic Party adopting a lot of the language of intersectionality to go after Bernie Sanders. They started whispering to reporters that he was a cis white male who was an anachronism, who had a problem with misogyny and a race problem. And that was clearly not coming from the left in any realistic way, but it became really the primary mode of attack against him until they started throwing the Russia stuff at him. So it's
and Corbyn too, right? Like those identity attacks on Corbyn in the name of like progressive politics came from the center and the center right to destroy one of the real prospects of a left-wing ascension to power of an important country.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's also the phenomenon of, Glenn talked about it being, sort of part of the dominant culture in a lot of corporate America. It's become part of how people settle office disputes now too, right? I mean, you have people who want to get somebody else's job, and this becomes the way to do it. And corporations have been bringing in, I hear from people all the time talking about my company brought in that same school of thought. We've had to go through that same training, and it's part of the mission at a lot of companies now. And I don't know how to think about it exactly, because what is it? It's clearly not left-wing in the traditional sense, but at the same time, the language is definitely coming from people from a left-wing type of thinker that probably grew out of the universities in the late 80s and early 90s, but it's an amalgam of a bunch of things, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, isn't this sort of like destroying any chance for an actual popular leftism in the country? Because there's, if you're a person on the left, you have to believe that even if, people don't call themselves leftists or even liberals, there is a popular support for the mindset of the left, right? Where you're sort of anti-authoritarian, you're pro-little guy, you're pro-worker, you're against, concentrated power, right? That general mindset exists and is pretty rampant throughout the electorate. But people who think that way do not combine that with cancel culture mentality. Those are two completely opposing ways of thinking, right? And the only place that exists, or where people are trying to make it a thing, is on Twitter or on, and I'm not trying to use that as a pejorative, because Twitter is increasingly becoming real life, because that's where the discourse takes place, and that's where people are kind of, it's a very top-down way of waging politics, but it's working apparently. But it's there's this weird elite fusionist Frankenstein project of fusing these two completely different ways of thinking into one, and there's maybe 1,000 people in urban centers around the country who can actually make this work in their heads. And otherwise though, throughout the country, no one would think this way, and so no one's going to actually adopt this way of thinking. And how do you translate that into a politics? It's impossible.
No, I was going to say the thing that I always find so bizarre about this left-wing mindset of we want to increase centralized power in order to advance left-wing objectives, in this case, regulating and constricting racist and bigoted and misogynistic speech in the workplace and the campus and punishing. And so what you have to do in order to do that is you have to empower institutions. You have to increase the centralized authority of institutions, the same institutions that people on the left reflexively regard as authoritarian and repressive.
Correctly.
And so it's like, begging Facebook and Twitter and Google to regulate discourse more aggressively than they ever wanted to. Okay, occasionally it's going to come out in your favor. Like you're going to get Alex Jones thrown off YouTube and you're going to get Milo Yiannopoulos banned from Twitter. But most of the time, in whose interest do you think these corporations are going to act? Not the marginalized factions, but the most powerful. So you see, for example, when the Israeli government makes requests to Facebook to ban the pages of Palestinian journalists and activists on the grounds of inciting terrorism, like 98% of those requests are granted. But when Palestinians request the same about the Israelis, they're almost completely ignored. Why? Because Israel wields a lot of power in Silicon Valley, and therefore Facebook will serve them and the Palestinians don't. So it's all exactly like we were just talking about. This left-wing ethos is supposed to be opposing the increase of centralized authority and vesting more power in corporate HR offices and corporate managers and administrators on campuses, and especially private corporations, to regulate speech is obviously going to backfire against anything resembling a left-wing politics.
Yeah, well, we saw that with the NLRB ruling. It was so funny that I believe the chair or whoever was the head of that 3-person panel, they were all Republicans, wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. The entire thing sounded like left-wing language. It was entirely like we're fighting racism, bigotry, offensive language. This has gone on long enough. Like we need to stop this. Like it could have been written by Robin DiAngelo, right? But actually, it was written by this Republican chair of the NLRB, and it's pretty obvious that if they're going to be able to if they're going to be able to authorize employers to fire anybody who says something offensive, and they gave some examples of things that are offensive, and it's mostly like the kind of things you would say in a heated argument with your boss, or like if you're on a picket line and there's a scab or something, maybe you might yell something sexist at them if it happens to be a woman, and like, obviously that's not pretty or nice, but it's the kind of thing that regular people do, just in the sense that sometimes people are lazy or greedy or they lose their cool. Sometimes they say something that's offensive. That's just like part of being a human being. But if they're authorizing employers to fire people for that and it's not considered to be union suppression, I'm wondering now if employers are purposely going to go out and try to like trigger their employees and like get them into a situation where they're much more likely to have that kind of outburst, or at least just say something that they could construe as offensive, because a lot of it's very subjective anyway. Like one of the cases, I think the case that they are actually ruled on to set this precedent was the case of an African American worker who started acting, saying you're treating me like a slave, and maybe making a few phrases like that. I guess it could be offensive in some context to somebody, but they said that, hey, that's offensive, and they cited a number of other cases similar to that. And so it seems like so much of this is about social control, and that's not only about the ends, but also the means. Like generally, like liberals prefer non-authoritarian means to achieve whatever goals you want, right? Like they don't love police states, they don't love like military solutions to diplomatic problems. And so I think when it comes to social problems, typically when it comes to like prejudice or bigotry, our approach has been based on intergroup contact theory, which is like Gordon Allpart's theory, which is like bring groups of people who are different together, let them talk it out. Yeah, they'll hate each other at first, but eventually they'll figure each other out, learn to like each other. It's worked very well. That's how like most of the gay rights movement was just about exposing people to like gay and lesbian folks in entertainment or in politics or in the arts. And people who felt very prejudiced against them, eventually that prejudice softened because they got to know those people, and that's generally been the approach. The like fire and brimstone approach has typically been seen as kind of very much a last resort, and something that maybe you would apply to like a politician, like a very bigoted politician. You might campaign against them to remove them or something, but you wouldn't like find like a construction worker who posted a status on a Facebook page and then like, okay, we got to get 10,000 people to call this company to fire this person, because like that would be seen as cruel and somewhat nihilistic, because it's not really how you create like an entire society-wide change by like singling out one person out of 300 million every now and then and like ruining their life. But like that's becoming more and more of a sport. Even those kinds of stories are elevated like CNN stories. I mean, we just had the CNN and Washington Post have both settled with that kid from the Covington Catholic School now. But what's remarkable to me is that 10 years ago, that would not have even been a national story. Like, they wouldn't have found just a random teenager who happened to be in an argument with some very odd people, both black nationalists and Native American guy, and then turn that into an actual, like, wall-to-wall coverage, 24/7 cable news story. And I don't even know if that's ideological. That seems like partly it's a matter of profit. Like, it's just very easy to take any kind of outrageous clickbait story involving people who are barely have any power at all. Sometimes they're just kids, and turning it into like, you know, you can drag so many eyeballs onto the TV and onto your computer screens and cell phones, smartphones, just by driving that outrage cycle. So I think part of this also is just that, you know, Jerry Springer's no longer on the air, but now every news show can be Jerry Springer if they want it to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think from the very beginning, this whole thing has felt to me like a bit of a red herring to try to get young people who otherwise might have been supportive or against any authoritarian solutions to support the opposite, right? So you take the Russiagate story. I was suspicious from the very beginning there because essentially what they were saying is, look, we had foreign interference, we had ignorance was so widespread that Donald Trump got elected, we had Brexit happen. This is all evidence that the system of sort of free exchange of ideas, the marketplace of ideas doesn't work. So now it's time to try something else. Right? And there was a huge attempt, I felt like, to play on the pessimism of young people during the Trump era and say we need to embrace a new top-down kind of a solution to things that are just not working right now. And suddenly you had, almost overnight, you had this massive propaganda campaign in support of, just as Glenn said, of the very institutions that were once most reviled by people who identified as liberals. When suddenly everybody was in favor of the FBI and the CIA, and they were the biggest heroes, and they were getting $1 million book deals as soon as they were leaving government. We would never have seen that, 15, 20 years ago. And it does feel like there's a strategic element behind some of that, right? Like that there's a conscious effort to try to get people to embrace that as a solution to political difficulties, as opposed to just the normal kind of agitation that they would have done in the past.
There's something that I can't figure out, though, just an inconsistency within this movement, because I think Jonathan Haidt writes about how there's this cohort of young people who came out of college and basically, or during in college, were sort of looked at the university administration as the surrogate helicopter parent that they no longer have anymore. And so every time they felt unsafe, they would appeal to authority. And now that same surrogate helicopter parent has come into the office in the form of the HR department. And so there's sort of an explanation for this almost thirst for authoritarianism. But what's also happening with this like defund police movement is the opposite, which is this idea of the defund police. To the extent that there is a coherent ideology there, it feels very libertarian. There's this idea that because the police, which is the government, has been dysfunctional in certain ways, we need to strip it of its funding, eliminate it, and I don't know, I guess allow people to work out their problems on their own without police intervention. It feels like very much this sort of like kind of libertarian fantasy world. It's like Ayn Randian fantasy world where you have which is completely inconsistent, right, with the calling the speech cops on everybody who violates speech, or calling HR in to discipline anybody who says anything to expresses an offensive idea. It feels very incoherent. I can't make sense.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think there's we should recognize some commonalities just in like sometimes things feel new that are actually very familiar, historically. So when I first began writing about politics, it was in the wake of the 9/11 attack, and the main reason they did so I mean, it was in part because I thought there were some issues about executive power abuses that were getting insufficient attention, but it was really more because of the climate of discourse and politics that had become so repressive because fear levels had been elevated so successfully in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and then anthrax attacks. People felt like, wow, we better give up power. We can't have so much free-flowing speech. Ari Fleischer kind of notoriously said, you better watch what you're saying. People lost their jobs, like Bill Maher, for saying things in the wake of 9/11 that kind of deviated from orthodoxy. There was a very repressive climate. People were being called, fifth columnists and terrorist lovers. That's what always happens. If you can create a villain that people are supposed to be afraid of, they're going to demand greater restrictions on all liberties of other people, including speech. Obviously, during the Cold War, the main villain was communists. And we saw a lot of that in the wake of Trump's election, both with Russiagate, where Russia became the new villainous foreign threat that was coming for all of our freedoms and infiltrating our institutions, but also just Trump himself. The idea that there was now a fascist takeover of the United States, that white supremacy in the sense of like the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazi groups weren't just these isolated small groups occasionally getting together in a group of 50 losers wearing armbands the way we thought about them for the last 6 decades accurately, but instead were some kind of like mass movement. And therefore, people were scared. They were scared of Trump and his fascism. They were scared of white supremacy. They were scared of neo-Nazism. They were scared of Russia. Just like 20 years ago, people were so afraid of 9/11 that they were willing to give up rights in the Patriot Act and all of the wars and in the speech codes and restrictions as well. And I think there's a lot of that going on. And it is interesting, the kind of tension that Leighton talks about too with this whole like abolish the police thing, because, the cause of social justice, of criminal justice reform on the left of the last 20 years has been to loosen and make less punitive the police state. But at the same time, it's also been to call for greater police enforcement of Wall Street criminals, of pedophiles, of rapists, of men who abuse women sexually. I don't recall, like with Ghislaine Maxwell when she was arrested, people saying, free her, let her go, don't put her in the, racist prison state, or like Roger Stone or Paul Manafort or Michael Flynn or any of those people, even though there was kind of a very liberal case to make that these was excess zealotry. So I think what's happening is this kind of traditional common exploitation of fear levels that are being jacked up, especially among kind of younger liberals in the name of fear of Trump and white supremacy and Russia, that's causing them to care less about civil liberties. At the same time that there's this, attempt to dress up everything that were traditionally right-wing institutions of power in this left-wing dressing, which is why it's so disgusting to see the GCHQ bathed in the rainbow flag or the CIA celebrating feminism. And I think a lot of this is corporations seeing that they can control their workers better, pit one another against them better in the name of progressive values in the workplace, and just idiot leftists and liberals are falling for it. Because there's no critical thinking involved about who really is benefiting from this power and how is it going to be wielded, and in whose hands, institutional hands, is this power necessarily being vested.
Also, I think there's a huge change in our business, right? In the media, first of all, the business is losing money. It's a very, very tight job market for everybody, and a lot of the big, quote unquote, left-leaning or blue-leaning news organizations started to see in the Trump years that Trump made them a lot of money. That was the first thing that they observed, that if you put the guy on television, it got good ratings. But the second thing was, they just started to be tempted by the Fox News formula, which was enormously successful, which is just to constantly create panics about sort of left-wing provocateurs and terrorists and feminazis and whatever it is. I mean, the formula is really simplistic, but it works. In terms of a business model, the way that Fox News did its thing, starting in the sort of mid '90s to now, there's always been that temptation. Well, why don't you just do that on the other side? And now we're starting to see that, basically that is the business model of a lot of these companies, MSNBCs especially, basically the news is a a succession of panic stories where we're being asked to look at something as the worst thing that's ever happened. That's whether it's kids in cages, or the the nation is in peril. Democracy itself is going to collapse tomorrow because Donald Trump is firing Jeff Sessions, or so you better go out and march. I mean, there's like been 30 or 40 of these stories in the last 4 years.
Lev Parnas. I don't even know who the fuck that is. I never knew. I just remember there was like a week on Twitter when oh my God, Lev Parnas has totally broken up the entire thing. It's like, to this day, I have no fucking clue who he is.
No, it's a point of pride. Go to the grave never knowing. Never Google it. Never Wikipedia it. Keep solidarity on that. I'm never going to do it.
You can actually get confused because they now happen so fast that you can like lose track of what it is you're supposed to be freaking out about. Like, oh, is that 4 days ago, or is that now? Like, what do I? So with the pandemic, which I think made this entire situation infinitely worse because everybody's home and everybody's online, even more than they were already, which is so bad for everybody's mental health. But that tendency to freak out and be terrified of things, which I think is, as Glenn pointed out, is really at the core of a lot of this. Like, the more people are afraid, the more they're going to be, calling for purity campaigns and that sort of thing. It's all been hugely exacerbated by, that media factor and by being indoors a lot.
Can I just quickly interject, just a question for you guys that I think it's worth addressing, because I think it's one of the most common objections to the stuff that we've all been doing, which is, okay, look, even if you're right that people occasionally lose their jobs unjustly, like they'll, concede the like David Shore case and a few others like that, they'll say in the middle of a pandemic with tens of thousands of people dying or hundreds of thousands of people dying, with tens of millions of people unemployed, and with this like mass uprising against racist police power and the police state, why, of all the things that you want to focus on, does this merit our attention? Why is it even like number 30 on our list of concerns? Why are you demanding that space be created to talk about this, given everything else that's going on? I'm curious about what your answer is.
It's an absolutely stupid argument, and it's also highly disingenuous because it tends to come from the same people who are like freaking out about like Allison Roman appropriating, recipes in the New York Times and talking shit about Marie Kondo and what's her name, And so it's coming from people who are obsessed with absolute trivialities that happen online, but also, we were talking about this in our episode about the NLRB ruling, which is that like this is the National Labor Relations Board has now handed down a ruling constraining labor rights using exactly this ideology as a pretext for doing so. So it's like, these are the real ramifications that come from what look like, petty internecine office politics among PMCs on Twitter, which it is. But, that stuff gets appropriated by people in positions of power and has consequences that really matter. So it's like downstream from now, a year from now, just I tremble at the idea of what of the ways in which both the government and corporations will be able to make you. I mean, we've got Chevron laying people off and excusing it, saying it was making their workforce more diverse. It's like, this stuff it does matter. It provides a rationale and a covering for the abuse of power by people with lots of power.
And to some extent, like, I agree with the critique, but maybe even more sincerely than the people who are making it, because when they're saying that we shouldn't be talking about this stuff, I'd be happy not to be talking about it. But because it exists and sucks up so much oxygen, we kind of have to deal with it at this point, right? Like, I would prefer for us to be talking about how do we rescue an economy where so many people have just been laid off, where so many people don't have access to healthcare, where so many people are on the verge of being evicted now as eviction kind of orders are being lifted and eviction aid is being taken away. I'd prefer to be talking about all that stuff, but instead you open the New York Times or you read New York Magazine, The Cut, and they're talking about how every interracial relationship needs to be conscious and aware of race all the time. Like, instead of talking about, the vast majority of people in the country and their needs, we're being divided up into tiny sects that are fighting each other over the most trivial things that you can imagine. And when that happens, that that is primarily what sucks us away from talking about police reform, from talking about economic reforms that we need, from talking about guaranteeing access to healthcare to everyone, talking about how to stop this virus and keep people safe from it. I think filling up so much of our time and our energy with this culture war that's not being initiated by our side because we don't like it, we don't want it to even be happening, unfortunately is serving that purpose of distracting us. And only by, I think, somewhat neutralizing it can we unite people enough to deal with some of the bigger problems that we're dealing with right now. And I say that with a lot of, that's not how I want it to be. That's not my preference. But at this point, I think some people thought we had to put our foot down because so much of what we're trying to address in those serious issues that you mentioned, Glenn, just can't be when everything's being sucked up by something else.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is like political to Glenn's question, which is that I would just turn it around and say we're living during one of the greatest spikes in inequality and upward shifts in market power in history. And the left is spending all of its time trying to convince everyone to check their privilege. It's a political argument. We're fighting for oxygen in the room, I think. Right. And so I think we can only I don't think there's enough space to wage this culture war and try and, systematically transform the country towards economic justice. You're fighting for what the left actually is. I mean, that's the question. There was what kind of conjured that, idea for me, was that I saw someone tweet at Matt actually and say, you know what? You used to write about how evil people are destroying the economy. What happened to you? And to me, that's what I'm saying to you. You used to care about evil people destroying the economy, and now you're spending all your time with this stuff. That's the point.
I don't know why George Floyd died. There was a very serious conversation about police reforms. Somehow that got directly related to old episodes of television shows being pulled off the air, South Park, Scrubs, The Office. Those things are just not only are they completely unnecessary, and I just oppose it as I hate censorship, but this substantive important cause got co-opted by complete nonsense. And you have to at some point actively reject the nonsense. If we just try to ignore it, it'll just keep happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's like the same person who's tweeting about cartoon voiceover artists is asking why you're troubling yourself with issues of free speech and free discourse.
Preposterous.
I also just want to add a couple things about that, which is, first of all, I think the more that's at stake, and there obviously is a lot at stake. This is clearly a transformative moment historically on a lot of different levels, probably the most transformative in our lifetime, given the combination of the pandemic, the economic crisis globally, and then this sustained protest movement. I think the more at stake there is, the more important it is to preserve the prerogatives of free discourse. So you can freely debate what are the right tactics, what are the ethical strategies, what are the most just outcomes, what is the best way to get there, what arguments are most persuasive. And the more you constrict the ability of people to do that, the more a movement becomes ossified and stagnant and just kind of blinded by its own unwillingness to entertain dissent. The other point, though, I think is even a more important one about why this is so important, and more so ever than now, which is if you're going to have an uprising, a popular uprising, which I do think we are having, and it can be even more powerful than it's been. One of the ways that elite power centers around the world have so successfully shielded their own power, even though they've abused it so grotesquely, right? Everyone can see that every policy enacted is done for the benefit of a tiny sliver of already wealthy people at the expense of everybody else. There's all this inchoate rage throughout the democratic world. The way they make sure that that rage never manifests into anything meaningful is to keep everyone divided and hating one another instead of unifying and focusing on power centers. And one of the things this movement, this discourse, orthodoxy, control does more than anything is it keeps us at each other's throats, right? Look at what the left has been saying over the last 3 weeks on Twitter about Matt. Oh my God, what the fuck? It's not hey, I have some disagreements about your current position on this particular debate. It's, wow, you used to be like a respectful journalist, and then like 8 weeks ago you started saying stuff that isn't perfectly aligned with what I think, and now you're a piece of trash and a piece of garbage who I'm gonna like block and unfollow, and I no longer consider you to be of any worth. And the more you do that, like, you just divvy yourself up more and more and more until there's always like a tiny cluster of people who haven't been declared existentially evil. And that to me is the most pernicious part of this new way of communicating. Is it prevents us from connecting as humans. It at exactly the moment when human unity and solidarity could be the most powerful, it's making us turn on each other, reporting on our neighbors, reporting on our coworkers, running to HR, canceling people on Twitter, demanding that journalists who you admired for 20 years suddenly, because of the last 8 weeks of dissent, be declared trash or on the other side. It's so self-destructive, just from like a humanistic and movement solidarity perspective.
Yeah, and a lot of that, we've seen a lot of that going back from the beginning of the Trump situation, right? I mean, I always thought it was interesting that when Hillary first said that line about the basket of deplorables, and her initial calculation was 1/3 of Trump supporters were basically irredeemably evil, all right? And then it was initially called like a huge political unforced error. Like the pundit class kind of said that she shouldn't have said that because that was going to be a mistake. But then when Trump won, almost instantaneously, it became basically taboo to say anything except that every single Trump voter was a white supremacist, right? And in other words, they're all not only deplorables, but they're actively, they're beyond redemption, right? That was one of the things that got me in trouble on Twitter, was saying I thought that the liberal position on people was that nobody's beyond redemption, right? And that's why we believe in prison reform, right? And that sort of thing. You're against the death penalty, that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, it's incredibly divisive. And also these ideas, they're not unimportant because these are very dangerous ideas. They're dangerous because they're effective, right? If you look at the way they've spread through institutional America in the last, 5 years or so, and universities are completely taken over by these considerations. We see in our own business, in the media business, and of course, because I'm in the media, this has a lot of importance to me. But when we start seeing situations where we can't report simple facts because everybody's afraid to talk about this issue or that issue, or talk about this aspect of the protests, or that renders the press completely dysfunctional, and that it does have a lot of importance to someone like me. But if that's true throughout institutional America, that's not an insignificant thing. That's a major thing, and I think you have to put it against the fact that there isn't a really big idea behind Trumpism. Like Trump is basically like a parody of an authoritarian movement. He got elected sort of basically based on the disgust that people had with neoliberal economics, and people were just sort of clamoring for something that was different. It wasn't like this from the ground up, brown shirt movement. It was sort of, it was an absurd reaction to something else. This is an organic movement that's growing in strength constantly, and it doesn't depend on one personality over another. It's an important thing, and it's intellectually has a lot of influence in this country now, I think, anyway.
Yeah, I would I think that it goes beyond just the media having to self-censor. It's now gotten to the point where self-respecting leftists are saying that if a journalist goes to a protest, if a journalist who some protesters have a problem with goes to a protest and starts filming it, then they are a legitimate target for threats of violence or actual violence to stop them from filming and documenting the protest. Like this is a argument that's made seriously by people who I've had arguments with. So it's like it's beyond just you've written something, we disagree with you, and now you should be canceled. Now it's like your very right to be able to document events in the world is up for question. and the arbiter of whether you have that right or not has been bestowed in anonymous mobs of masked people. That's really dark, and that's it's like, if the logic is carrying our civic culture to that point of view, then I don't see why anybody could fail to acknowledge that this debate over quote unquote cancel culture is actually meaningful and not just some navel gazing bullshit.
And just to interrupt on that, because I know we're talking about Michael Tracy, right? So
well, let me just interject, because like Leighton has an article going back 3 years, and Lee Fong has been talking about this for a long time too, that like attacking journalists has been a common tactic of Antifa. Like, there's a lot of journalists who have had the shit kicked out of them by white kids calling themselves anti-fascists. Oftentimes for doing nothing more than just filming protests and refusing to obey orders, or other times just for no reason. So yeah, like Michael Tracy is the latest of the examples, but there's a long line of them. Leighton actually has an article documenting them. Lee has done the same, of where this is a common movement, like based on the idea that we have the right to dole out violence, street violence, gang violence, to whoever we decide is an adversary to our movement enough to justify kicking their teeth out or breaking their ribs or putting them in the hospital.
Yeah, and they make that argument, and then simultaneous to that, there's the pressure that other people feel watching this happen to not interject and defend Michael Tracy, because then you're going to get it. Oh, you're a Michael Tracy now, LOL, right? Like, and nobody wants to be the person who gets branded as the person who defends the disreputable person.
I mean, that really does bring me back in my memory. Was we're talking about, because Matt, your article was titled, how the left has become the right, in terms of it's adopted some of the same personality characteristics as the right. Because I remember when I was in high school, and I guess I was in a fairly conservative area. I was in the South, but there were probably a fair number of Democrats in the classroom, like young liberal kids too. But at that point, gay marriage wasn't very popular. I remember I was defending like gay marriage. I was like, you should let people marry, just like black-white marriage was illegal. We should allow people of same-sex to marry. People kept asking me, well, am I gay? Like, are you gay? Like, and I was like, no. I'm like, it's not about me. It's not about my personal like orientation. It's like, I just think it's fair and it's right to let them marry. And I think the same exact thing happens when I would like argue to treat undocumented immigrants humanely, or argue against the death penalty, or for criminals' rights, and so on and so forth. There's generally, whenever you're stuck defending somebody, even if you aren't that person or you don't share their attributes, part of you feels a little bit nervous doing it because you think that you're going to be smeared as synonymous with whatever the worst characteristics of that person are. And I think that's like part of the classic like tradition of liberalism as it was practiced by like the ACLU for many years, was that everybody should have the same rights. It doesn't really matter who they are. And even in the latest, so Padma Lakshmi does like this food show where she goes around the world, around America, and talks to people about their food culture. She went to the border in El Paso across from Ciudad Juarez, and she talked to a Hispanic woman who works for the ACLU, and she was talking about how they're defending the rights of immigrants. And at one point, Padma brings up, well, hey, you even defended the rights of like far-right people or like neo-Nazi people to have demonstrations and stuff. And the Hispanic woman turns to her and she says, well, we can't pick and choose who we defend. And that's generally what I believe my entire life. Like, everybody has certain rights. It doesn't really matter who they are or what they're doing. Like, they have those rights. It doesn't mean that I agree with whatever they're saying or doing either.
There are controversial cases like the one you referenced, like, and I know obviously from having my own history of defending the First Amendment rights of white supremacists, like, the ACLU's defense of neo-Nazis is a controversial thing, and their position is, look, we're not defending this person, we hate them as much as you do, we're defending the right, and you have to defend the right in all cases, and the fact that you defended it in this particular case doesn't mean you like the person. But there's way less controversial instances that express that principle. For example, liberals, every liberal pretty much by definition, hated Guantanamo, despite the fact that some of the people at Guantanamo were actually radical terrorists. They were people who had either blown things up and killed innocent people or were plotting to do that and believed in it and wanted to. Like, there were definitely some of the people there who were that. And you would make the argument in 2005, look, it's wrong, even if the people there, some of them, a lot of them, whatever you want to say, are terrorists because it's wrong on principle to imprison people in the middle of an ocean without charges and trial. It doesn't fucking matter if some of them are terrorists. I'm not saying I like them or dislike them. Nor does it even matter if they themselves, if they had power, would abide by the principles that I'm demanding that be applied to them. We have to have principles that get universally applied. I spent the last 3 days saying, like, journalists shouldn't be attacked physically, and all people could focus on is, do I like this particular journalist in question or not?
Well, it's funny because that recalls something to me, which is that when I watched the Tom Cotton fiasco go down, when I was working at the Intercept, I was on Capitol Hill all the time. I was always trying to talk to Tom Cotton. He was always blowing me off. I don't think I had that much in common with him politically. But when I watched that debacle go down at the New York Times, I thought to myself, is he really the most extreme person that the New York Times has ever published in their op-ed page? And then if you go back and look, they published like someone from the Haqqani network of the Taliban. Like, the Taliban like literally blew up a hotel I was staying in one time in Pakistan. I wasn't in the hotel, thankfully. It was after I had left. But like, these are pretty terrible people. And yet, if I worked at the New York Times, I would still think it's newsworthy to publish their point of view because we're like literally in a war with them. I think it's in American people's interest to know what they have to say. But when I think about like people freaking out about these things, like I can think of far more extreme examples than what are causing the current freakouts of times when we applied liberal principles to people who we detest what they're doing, we detest their ideology, we detest like everything about them, pretty much except the fact that we think that they still have rights. And it's remarkable to me that someone like Michael Tracy ends up, who just like reports from a slightly heterodox point of view sometimes, becomes the topic of hatred when, we're the people in Portland, many of the people who are angry at him want to eliminate prisons and police. There'll be people like multiple rapists, serial killers, people who probably blew stuff up, who will be walking the streets if you do that. I'm sure they're a lot worse than Michael Tracy, but it's a very it's something I think where if you get too obsessed with hating someone, sometimes you lose track of your logic a little bit, and I think that may have been the case with what's happening with Tracy.
I have a question for all of you. Where do you all think this thing comes from, where there's this mania now for just sort of separating people into good people, bad people, right? So you talk about the Tom Cotton debate. People could not get past the fact that Tom Cotton sucks, his editorial sucked. None of the other issues were relevant. You couldn't get anybody to talk about them because that was the only thing they wanted to come back to. And it seems like every single one of these debates comes down to whether or not the person is a good person or a bad person. If you try to say something like, it's not a good thing if there's no place for somebody like Andrew Sullivan anywhere in the blue-leaning media sphere, all anybody wants to talk about is the worst thing that Andrew Sullivan ever wrote, and is he are you a supporter or not a supporter? Like, what is that about? Where is that coming from? I don't really fully understand it.
I mean, I think it's all about in-groups and out-groups. It's sort of like, again, to bring it back to this puritanical analogy, not to get too nerdy, but Max Weber wrote about this and about how, the Calvinists believed in predetermination. There were certain people who were elected and were going to go to heaven, and then other people were damned and they were going to go to hell, and there's nothing you could do about it. There were no acts that you could perform in life to make that determination. So what everybody started to do was to believe that they were part of the elect and to very ostentatiously display their virtue as much as possible in order to show everybody else that they were actually among the elect. So this is like deep embedded in the veins of just American culture. And I think that there's this dynamic going on, which is similar to that now, which is like social media has set up the incentive structure for people to need to signal their virtue as much as possible. But part of that is demonstrating which tribe you belong to and which tribe you don't, demonstrating that this person is part of my in-group and this person is not. So I think it's almost like this effort to purge people out of your clique of folks in order to not allow them to contaminate your your little tribe. And that comes out of this sort of fear that if you are contaminated and other people notice it, then sort of the eye of Sauron is going to turn to you, and you're going to be in the middle. You're going to be the next witch being hunted. So I'm mixing a lot of metaphors here, but it's like I'm not articulating this very well because it's a very vague idea in my head, but I think it has a lot to do with this sort of this need to divide the world into friends, allies, and enemies, in order to demonstrate to everybody that you are among the allies, and that the focus of their attention should not be on you.
Yeah, I have a hunch that there's like a direct correlation with people's like perceived threat levels. Like when things are really scary and when people think there's like a really high threat to themselves or to, their culture or whatever, I think people really start to get sort of down to brass tacks and have to figure out, and this could be like a really fundamental human impulse, but like you immediately just have to figure out, okay, who's on my side and who's not on my side, and let's like split up and see things really, quote unquote, clearly that way. I mean, this could be naive of me, but like, I feel like a lot of it may have to do with Trump and just the way that, we're right now, like just a few months out from the election. I say naive because that suggests that maybe it could subside, right? It could just go away. I don't know if that's totally naive. I don't know if that's a fantasy, but that's my sense right now. It's just all about the threat level.
I mean, Jonathan Haidt, he is one of the social psychologists who studies like the origins of human morality and like why we have our political beliefs. And he's secular, like he's born and raised Jewish, but I think he's an atheist. But something he says is that like religion has like a certain evolutionary kind of purpose in human society, and it's kind of built into our minds to some extent. So I think also for a lot of people who are secular, maybe they don't have a traditional form of religion. Like I've noticed, I'm not trying to make a racial generalization because I hate racial generalizations. I hate the concept of race, honestly. But I've noticed that like a lot of the people at these protests are white. Like even like where I grew up in Atlanta, if you look at the protests, it's like 60 or 70% white, which is like really unusual if you know the demographics of Atlanta, or like it would be unusual if it was representative of the population. And I think like a lot of like Black and Latino people are very religious. They go to church every Sunday. They're very religious churchgoers. Like they have a way to channel their religion. And I think a lot of these younger secular people, this is kind of a religion for them. And like one of the like precepts in most religions, at least like monotheistic ones, is that there's like sins and there's sinners, right? Like, and I think that if you don't have like a religious text to do that, you can kind of start transforming your political beliefs into that. And I think that's part of why you want to make good people and bad people, rather than like good ideas and bad ideas, and we're all trying to figure these things out. We're all flawed and messed up, but we're going to get there. But rather, there's actually like demons out there and there's angels out there. And like the main goal is to vanquish the demons, right? And like at some level, anyone who's like an orthodox religious believer and like the big Abrahamic faiths kind of believes that. And I think that if you have that construct in your mind, even if you're not a religious person, it's very easy to fall into that kind of thinking. I think that in huge like secular dictatorships like Mao's China, they had that kind of thinking, or in the Soviet Union, they had that kind of thinking as well. And I think it's very easy to manifest your politics into that if you don't have somewhere else to go to that. Even if you're not a religious person, if you're like spiritual and have meditation and so on, like if you don't have any of that at all, but like on the daily you feel like you're fighting against the forces of evil, being involved on Twitter fights or being involved in kind of a revolt within your white collar workspace, I think that it's kind of filling a psychological need for you. And I feel for people in that, in the sense that they are going to politics to achieve that because they don't have it anywhere else. And I think that even the analogy of being woke, like that's like being reborn or accepting faith or Jesus.
I think it's such a critical component to all of this. There's been like this social science question for a while about why is it in the West, where there's increasing economic prosperity and opportunity, and where there's this technology that was supposed to be designed above all else to foster human connectiveness, which is the internet, right? That was the promise of it, was that we were going to be more connected to one another than ever before. And yet in exactly those places where the internet is most pervasive, where society is most advanced from an economic perspective, you have the highest rates of depression, mental illness, suicide, and addiction. And there's a lot of social science study and data now about exactly what Zed just said, which is if you think about how we developed as humans for tens of thousands of years, it was in small villages, very connected to small communities. Everybody knew us. We knew everybody else. We had religion. We had spirituality. We had a societal purpose. And then suddenly the Industrial Revolution comes very recently, just a few hundred years ago, and we're suddenly now all atomized in these big cities. We're away from our parents. We don't have any small communities. We don't talk to our neighbors. With the internet, we've never been more alone, right? We're all like sort of in our cubicles or in our homes, navigating the world through this digital medium, and it has really deprived people of what they need psychologically, which is a sense of broader purpose, because that's what religion provides and that's what community provides. And I think you do see, it's been fascinating, there's an obvious, overt, dominant, you could even say religious overtone to this new Black Lives Matter movement, with people on the grounds with their hands in the air, the way you see in the evangelical churches. There's been washing of feet, which is, very much like iconography from Catholicism and Jesus, rituals and chanting and just like martyrs. And so I think that the way we're built is to be tribal. We need to feel like we're part of a group that's better than those groups over there. And so dividing people up and saying, well, Matt Taibbi is making an argument or Zed's making an argument with which I disagree is insufficient to give us that like primitive need that we all have to say, no, it's actually more than that. It's that I'm part of this group that is better than all of those groups. And I'm a member of this group. And to be a member of this group, you have to adhere to this dogma. And as is true of any religion, who are the people who are most hated? It's not the ones who begin with the other religious views, rejecting it from the start. It's the heretics, the people who you think are part of your religious tribe and end up blaspheming against the core dogmas, which is what I think we're seeing a lot of. So that's why I think where this need is coming from, to say it's not that you have a good or bad argument, but you're a good or bad person. It goes back to this religious and spiritual DNA that kind of shapes and defines who we are, and that modern society is really depriving us of.
Yeah, it's really creepy, because I understand that if we have a generation of people that's growing up without religion and they want to find a replacement, but this is such a bad replacement. It's like it's like the worst kind of, if you read White Fragility, it reads a lot like cult literature, right? I mean, it's really hyper simplistic. There's no possibility for redemption or any kind of mutual understanding. It's deeply formulaic thinking, and that what we're seeing a lot of is just this very sort of rigid, kind of religious attitude towards politics. But it's got all the negatives of religion and almost none of the positives of it in this belief system. There's no avenue to redemption or mutual understanding or grace or any of those things. It's just good person, bad person, in the group, out of the group. Depressing.
It's, though, speaking of White Fragility, I mean, part of me, I can't help but to suspect that, the self-flagellating, self-hating white people who absorb that book and who kind of demonstrate their contempt for their race, or again, I'm like Zed, I don't even like the concept of race, but who express their contempt for their historical legacy, I guess. How much of that is driven by altruism versus how much of it is driven by a desperate need to distinguish yourself from those other white people, right? Like, it's like there's a lot of this, I mean, race and class is inextricably linked in America, and no matter what dimension you look at in America. But there's a strong class dimension to it. I've said this to Zed and Sean before, but it kind of reminds me of the beginnings of the progressive movement in the 1920s in New York was from sort of upper middle class and affluent Jews in the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side who were mortified by the poor Jews from Eastern Europe that were flooding into the Lower East Side. And so there was this, the progressive movement was this drive to assimilate those people as soon as possible, because they didn't want the WASPs looking at Jews and having these Lower East Side peasant type people in mind. And so I think that there's some of that among like college educated white people in the cities and the suburbs, looking at the white people who voted for Trump, and doing everything they can to sort of break themselves off so that, they're just embarrassed by those people. And so they are just ostentatiously exhibiting their distinction from those.
I think all of that is going on, and I think one more point that has to be emphasized, and my colleague Maz Hussein has talked about this a lot. He started reading about the history of plagues. It's very common when there's a plague. Plagues are fucking scary, right? Like, go back to like all kinds of new cults and apocalyptic movements. Like, go back to, what it was like in February when we first started realizing we're going to be confined to our homes indefinitely. There's this like incredibly fatal, highly contagious, complex, unknown, scary new virus being transmitted. It's going to upend our lives in all sorts of ways. We're suddenly even more disconnected from everything that we had in our lives. Like, we lost everything that we had in our lives. Like, the few things that were giving us connectivity to this community, we were suddenly literally locked in our homes. So the need for purpose and kind of a higher transcendent movement and a fanaticism that it expressed itself in is very connected, I think, to the pandemic and to the quarantine and isolation that we all found ourselves in, and kind of exacerbated all of these worst human needs. And the fact that we're all at home trapped and then having these wars on social media, I think is just like giving us this, it's this need on steroids to make sure that we're falling on the right side of whatever lines we're drawing, like the one that Leighton just drew of the good and the bad white people, or the good and the bad Jews, or just the good and the bad people. That's the new religion, is to make sure that you are, part of the holy and the blessed. And those lines get drawn as part of that exercise.
Whatever the religion is, I think Michael Tracy is going to be one of the chief icons of it in some way or another, right? He's going to be one of the main characters in the Antichrist book. Yeah, exactly. I feel bad for him.
All right, are we?
I think we have one last question for Matt, which is, what happened to you?
To be fair, I think Glenn got that one more first, right? That started with you with the Russia thing, and like that was like every third tweet to you at one point. It felt like.
Yeah, and I was always like, you know what? I don't know what you're remembering, but there was like never a time when I was this loyal, subservient spokesperson for the Democratic Party, nor was I ever this like fan of the CIA and the FBI and like running around hysterical about whatever new foreign threats. So I don't know what the fuck you mean. What happened to me? I feel like I'm doing the same thing that I've been doing for the last 15 years.
It is very funny, but that's one of about 50 things that people say to you to try to get you to not say whatever it is that you're saying at the time. Yeah, exactly. And after years of not blocking or muting people, like I had a policy that was pretty strict about that. Now I've just been like fanatic.
Log off, dude. Go get some fresh air. Said by people who are like sitting in front of their fucking monitors, like in your mentions, monitoring everything you're saying. Like, go get off the computer and go for a fucking walk. You go for a fucking walk.
Hi everyone, it's Zed here. Thanks for watching. My friends Leighton and Shant and I launched the Backchannel as a way to add a dose of reality to the insular online discourse that's shaping our politics right now. It's an experiment, and for it to continue, we could really use your support. We've launched a Patreon page at patreon.com/thebackchannel, where you can pledge a small amount to help the show expand and improve. Thanks so much for your support, and thanks for watching.